So UK inflation, well, is it over yet? At 6.8%, it's still extremely elevated and it might not be over yet. There's certain factors that still aren't under control, and this is what I'll be deep diving in this video today. When comparing it to the US has a much greater handle on the inflation, where theirs is closer to 3%, their targeted range, and we're still highly elevated, as mentioned, at that almost 7% range, which is exactly where we don't want to be. So we need to understand how and what is the problem with our inflation, comparing it to other inflation rates around the world. In this video, I'll be laying out the difference between the cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. These two are detrimental to what is driving inflation when comparing it to the US and the UK. These two diverge, and exactly the reason why the UK is experiencing inflation very differently to the US. So let's not waste any more time and get into exactly what cost push inflation is. So what's cost push inflation? Well, on the producer side, this is where the cost of the products and services is getting more expensive due to factors out of their control. And what this means is, because those costs are higher, to maintain the same level of profit margin, they need to raise their prices, which in turn increases the prices of goods and services, resulting in inflation. And this is a point in which the UK is experiencing high amounts of cost push inflation due to the Ukraine crisis, which is increasing different products and goods and services, such as food and such as energy, which is one of the main drivers in the UK inflation rate. And this is, when compared to the US, a very stark factor and diverging factor, which is a difference between one of the inflation points. But I'm going to get into the US inflation point, which differs to the UK massively. So what's the difference between demand pull inflation and cost push inflation? Well, demand pull inflation focuses much more heavily on consumers, whereas cost push inflation is much more producer driven inflation. When we consider what factors influence demand pull inflation, we can consider things like interest rates and then also quantitative easing methods, which drives people to spend more, in turn increasing inflation as products and services become higher, as people are willing to spend more on different purchases such as goods and services. Now, the US is primarily driven by demand pull inflation, which can be easier controlled with monetary policy tools, whereas the UK is a combined element of both these inflation types, which is much harder to control due to external factors. So we can see just why it's so much harder for the UK to bring that inflation rate down. Looking at the chart now, we can see in 2020 to 2021, it was in that range between the 1% and 2%, which is in line with the Bank of England's expectation at 2%. However, from 2021 all the way into 2022 and 2023, we can see the UK inflation got as high as almost 11% plus. And now, though it's come back down at that 6.8%, it's still really elevated when comparing it to that Bank of England target. So why is UK inflation still so elevated? Well, it's due to the food and oil. Well, because of the Ukraine crisis with Russia, Russia has obviously had those sanctions in place, which stops us taking their oil and food, which is causing that cost push inflation, as I mentioned. There's a shortage of lots of different factors and foods, which is creating massive impacts on our economy. When we take a look now at our food and rising grocery costs, we can see all the different rises, such as sugar, olive oil, sauces, eggs. All of these have increased by 20 up to 50% rise in percentage, which is incredible when considering these are low value goods, which have extortionately gone much higher just because of this cost push inflation pressure. So with this pressure, obviously comes response. This is where the Bank of England has raised the UK interest rate from 0.25% to 5.25%. in 2023. They've been extremely aggressive to try bring down this inflation. Now we have to question the efficacy of the interest rates that are going to be impacting the UK inflation. The question is, will these work enough to bring down that inflation rate to the Bank of England's target of 2%? Now, as much as the UK has been experiencing that demand pull inflation, we are seeing pullbacks in different areas, such as quantitative easing. Spending has reduced, rents are coming down, and we're seeing the housing market taking a bit more pressure, which is definitely helping with the inflation rate. But as mentioned, the UK is mainly driven through that external factors from the Ukraine crisis, such as food and oil, which is weighing in heavily in terms of what the proportions are of inflation. So this is where my question comes in. Is the UK still going to be extremely elevated with their inflation rate? I believe it will be because of this cost push inflation pressure until we see some easing in the Ukraine war, where sanctions suddenly come in for Russia and that eases the supply chain a little bit. That will obviously help with these types of pressures. So we'll have to wait and see until that actually plays out. But we can see that the difference is stark when we're talking about demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Now, the next potential problem is a wage spiral. This is a serious concern in the UK and another reason why inflation might not be over yet. Due to sustained pay rises around the UK in many different sectors, this could contribute to the demand pull inflation, increasing once again, sustaining that inflation rate and not getting it down to that Bank of England target rate of 2%. Now, how likely is a wage spiral? Well, the UK has already said that the government are going to raise that state pension to 10% greater, and that will happen in April. But the biggest argument is the wage spiral going to be a long-term fix? Well, we could potentially see this problem lasting years rather than months because of the impact of just how devastating a wage spiral can be. It happened in the 70s, but so far there's no evidence of this happening again. But I would mention that this sort of thing is a very lagging indicator. Now, lagging indicators are a problem for any economy because we don't have the up-to-date numbers, meaning we can't respond appropriately with the right action. We don't understand just how significant we need to raise rates or quantitative tighten to that point because of the numbers which we are getting through. Now, it may not be a concern currently, but it's one thing that could happen in the future, especially as we have seen a lot of pay rises currently in 2023 and 2022. And as these come through, this could potentially become a future problem, but it's just one thing to consider in sustained inflation for the UK. Now, when comparing the US inflation rate, it's a very similar story to the UK, but the difference is the actual deceleration of inflation. It's gone from 8.3% in October 22 to 3.2% as of July 23. So we can see that inflation is much lower in the US, and this has been primarily driven through demand pull inflation. Because of the factors of interest rates and other quantitative tightening measures having a much greater hold and impact on the US inflation, they've been able to get it closer to their target range of 2.5%. So we can see just how the difference has ranged from the US to the UK. So how can the UK counteract the inflationary pressures from cost push inflation and demand pull inflation? Well, on the demand pull inflation side, they've already started with interest rates and quantitative tightening, and that's obviously putting pressure a lot more on the consumer, particularly in places like mortgage rates and housing. We're already starting to see a decline in these particular areas. As people borrow less, that means there's less liquidity in the system for spending, stopping that inflationary pressure from getting out of control. And I believe we're already seeing this in the numbers, and the demand pool side is slowly coming down as we've gone from almost 11% now to almost 7% or just under 7%. So we're already seeing this in the numbers, but the biggest point is how we're going to counteract this cost push inflationary pressures. And I think this will take a lot more time. And it's a reason why I believe that inflation isn't over yet. I think if we start to see some sanctions being lifted in Russia with the Ukraine conflict potentially coming to an end at some point in the future, then we'll start to see some easing up of those inflationary pressures. The other factor is down to the wage spiral as well. As long as the wage spiral doesn't get too out of control, we can potentially see these inflationary pressures come down slowly. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a like and leave a comment letting me know your thoughts about the potential problem for a wage spiral and other factors that are influencing the UK inflation rate. So I'll see you guys in the next one. I'll be talking about the housing market next, so make sure to stay tuned, and I'll see you guys in the next one.